It was 1 o'clock in the morning when the pounding on my front door pulled me out of sleep. Not a gentle knock. Not the sound of a neighbor dropping by late. It was frantic, desperate, echoing through the quiet of the house like an alarm bell. I rushed down the hallway, my heart already racing before I even turned the knob. And then I saw her. My daughter Emily collapsed against the doorframe, pale and shaking, her eyes wide with terror. She slid into my arms before I could even ask what had happened. Her skin clammy, her breath short and broken. In that moment, all the training I had as a police officer didn't matter. I wasn't Sergeant Dawson. 20 years on the force, I was just a mother holding her child, trying to keep her from falling apart. Emily was 26, a grown woman by any measure. But in my arms, she felt as fragile as she did the day she came home from the hospital. Her hair was tangled, her cheek bruised, and when I touched her hand, I felt the faint tremor of someone who had been pushed far beyond fear. The house was silent except for her uneven breathing. Outside, the street was empty, the kind of stillness only small towns have at that hour. Inside, my thoughts were anything but still. I kept asking myself what had led us here. The truth is, for months I had noticed changes in Emily. She had grown quieter, more withdrawn. Phone calls unanswered, visits shorter than usual, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Every time I asked if something was wrong, she brushed me off. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she was fine, that she just needed space. But as I sat on the floor holding her shaking body, I knew denial had been my mistake. Emily had always been my anchor after her father passed away. We'd built a life together on the land my parents left us 40 acres just outside town. That land wasn't just soil and trees. It was memory, safety, and legacy. It was supposed to be the ground we could always come back to, no matter how rough life became. I had no idea then how much that inheritance would matter, how it would become both a weapon and a shield in the storm that was coming. As I held Emily that night, I didn't know the full story yet. I didn't know who had hurt her or what kind of darkness had been creeping into her life. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about my daughter collapsing at my door. This was the beginning of a fight that would test everything I had: my strength as a mother, my instincts as a cop, and the very foundation of the life we'd built on that land. And that night, as I lifted Emily into my arms and carried her inside, I could already feel the storm pressing in. The real details of that night would unfold soon, but even then, in the stillness of my living room, I knew nothing in our lives would ever be the same. Emily's body was limp in my arms as I pulled her inside, the night air clinging to us both like a cold sheet. My training told me to scan quickly, check her breathing, find the source of her pain, but my heart only screamed that my daughter was breaking right in front of me. Her cheek carried a dark bruise that hadn't been there the last time I saw her. A thin line of blood traced down from her lip. Her knees were scraped raw, the kind of injury that spoke of being shoved, not stumbled. I laid her gently on the couch, my hands trembling as I searched for more signs of harm. That's when her phone slipped from her pocket and lit up the dim room. The screen buzzed with messages, one after another, the harsh glow of the words slicing through the silence. I didn't need to read them all to understand. Jason. His name burned itself into my thoughts as the threats scrolled across the glass. Promises of control, reminders that she was his, curses that made my chest tighten with rage. In that instant, two versions of myself collided. The mother in me wanted to smash the phone, to shield Emily from every cruel word. The police officer in me knew better. Every bruise, every word, every threat was evidence. Evidence that might be the only thing standing between my daughter and the man who wanted to destroy her. My hands shook as I set the phone down on the coffee table, forcing myself to breathe, to think. Emily stirred weakly, whispering apologies I never should have heard from her lips. I hushed her gently, my heart breaking, but I also began to catalog everything in my mind. The time, the condition of her clothes, the pattern of her injuries, the string of texts. Every detail mattered now. When her breathing grew shallow again, I didn't hesitate. I carried her to my car and drove through the empty streets to the emergency room, the tires humming against the asphalt like a steady drumbeat. Under the fluorescent lights, the medical staff moved quickly, documenting her injuries with cameras and notes. I stood at the foot of the bed, watching as strangers captured the proof of her suffering, and for once, I was grateful for the sterile distance of procedure. They weren't just tending to her wounds, they were building the record that I knew I would need. As I gripped the back of the plastic chair, the anger that had threatened to unravel me earlier began to harden into resolve. I couldn't erase what Jason had already done, but I could make damn sure that this night didn't vanish into silence like so many others. I could ensure that his threats, his violence, his cruelty had a trail that even he couldn't bury. That night, as I sat under the cold hospital lights listening to the faint beeping of machines, I made a vow to myself. This would not be forgotten. Not by me. Not by the law. Tonight was the first page of a record that I would keep building, piece by piece, until justice caught up with Jason. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The morning after that long night at the hospital, I stepped out onto my porch with a heaviness pressing down on me. The sun was just coming up, brushing the sky with pale streaks of gold, but it didn't bring me any comfort. My thoughts were still tangled in the images of Emily's bruises, the buzzing of her phone, and the silence in her eyes. That's when my neighbor, Linda Harper, crossed the street with a broom still in her hand. She looked concerned, her eyes searching mine as if she already knew something had gone terribly wrong. When I finally admitted that Emily had come to me in the middle of the night, hurt and terrified, Linda nodded firmly. She told me her porch camera might have caught something. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief, a shred of proof beyond just our words. Later that morning, she showed me the footage. I watched Emily appear on the screen, barely able to stand, knocking weakly at my door, her voice trembling as she called for me. Hearing her cry again was like having my chest split open. But I also knew this was crucial. I asked Linda to send me a copy, and she did, without hesitation. That video wasn't just heartbreaking, it was undeniable evidence. Still, even with the truth right there in my hands, I could feel the weight of something darker building around us. At the grocery store, I caught whispers trailing after me. Some said I was just a mother twisting the truth because of my badge. Others muttered that Emily had probably exaggerated, that young wives make up stories when marriages get rocky. Each word cut deeper than I expected, not because I cared what people thought of me, but because I knew every rumor made Emily's courage harder to sustain. Gossip was its own kind of weapon, and Jason knew how to wield it. I kept collecting everything I could. Screenshots of every threatening text. Copies of every medical note and photo from the hospital. I saved them all in multiple places on drives, on cloud backups, because I knew Jason would try to erase the truth any way he could. Then one evening, I came home to find an envelope shoved under my door. Inside was a scrap of paper with scrawled words, "Shut up or you'll lose your daughter." My hands trembled as I read it, not from fear, but from fury. Whoever left it wanted me to break, to stay silent. Instead, it lit something unshakable inside me. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about bruises or even about Jason anymore. It was about truth itself, about fighting against lies that spread like wildfire through a small town. I wasn't just protecting my daughter's body anymore. I was protecting her story, her voice, and our family's dignity. And as I tucked that note into my growing folder of evidence, I knew the worst was still ahead. Rumors were one thing, but soon, Jason would strike in a way I hadn't even imagined. The fight was about to cut much deeper, straight into our family's very foundation. The call came in the middle of the afternoon, just when I thought I had a moment to breathe. It was Ben Foster, a clerk I'd known for years at the county records office. His voice carried a weight I couldn't ignore. He told me my name and Emily's had just appeared on a land transfer file, and something about it didn't sit right. My chest tightened instantly. I drove straight to his office, the steering wheel slick under my palms from the sweat gathering there. When I walked in, Ben's face said it all serious, uneasy. He slid a folder across his desk, and my heart dropped before I even opened it. Inside were the papers that claimed Emily had signed her piece of property over to a woman I'd never heard of. I stared at the shaky handwriting, my eyes refusing to believe what I was seeing. The letters were crooked, uneven, nothing like Emily's steady hand. And then I saw my own name scrawled awkwardly, as if someone thought they could mimic me with just a glance. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't enough for Jason to break my daughter's spirit, to bruise her body and leave her terrified in the middle of the night. He had gone further. He had tried to erase her future, to strip her of the land my father had worked himself into the ground to earn. The land meant to be Emily's inheritance. That land wasn't just soil and fences. It was the last piece of him we had left. I traced my finger along the notary stamp and felt my anger sharpen. The stamp didn't even line up with the official logs. It was a sloppy forgery, but dangerous all the same. Jason hadn't just crossed the line of decency, he had crossed into outright fraud. For a moment, I let the heartbreak wash over me. I thought of Emily as a little girl, running barefoot across that land, laughing with the kind of freedom only a child knows. And now, the man she married had tried to steal it from under her nose. My grief turned into something else: resolve. I asked Ben for certified copies of everything. He handed them over quickly, his hands almost shaking, and warned me to be careful. He suspected someone inside the office had helped push the papers through. That knowledge made the air feel heavier, like corruption was pressing down on us from every corner. Walking out of that building with the folder tucked under my arm, I knew this battle had escalated. It was no longer just about protecting Emily from bruises and threats. It was about defending our name, our history, and the truth itself. Jason wasn't only an abuser, he was a thief, and he thought he was untouchable. As I stepped back into the sunlight, I felt the weight of the evidence pull at me. My pulse quickened. Not with fear this time, but with anticipation. This wasn't going to end in whispers or forged signatures. The time was coming when I would have to look Jason in the eye and make sure he knew his lies wouldn't stand against me. The pawn shop sat on the edge of town, its windows clouded with dust, its neon sign flickering like it could give out at any second. The smell hit me first, stale cigarettes mixed with motor oil, a stench of desperation baked into the walls. I pushed through the door, folder of evidence pressed tight against my chest. Jason was in the back office, lounging behind a scarred wooden desk, a stack of bills spread out in front of him. He looked up with that smug grin I'd come to know too well, the one that said he thought he had already won. He leaned back in his chair like I was no threat at all. But I had walked in with more than fury, I had proof. I laid the folder on his desk. One piece at a time, photographs of Emily's injuries, medical reports stamped and signed, the porch footage, the threatening messages, and finally, the forged deed with its sloppy signatures. Each page was a nail in the coffin he had built for himself. For a flicker of a second, I saw his grin falter, but then he masked it with mockery. He spat out words meant to intimidate me, to remind me that he had money and lawyers, and that in his mind, I was just a mother grasping at straws. Inside, my blood boiled, but I held my ground. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to show him that the tide had shifted, that his arrogance was about to meet a wall he couldn't climb. That night, I knew I needed more. Someone from his circle who could break his story open from the inside. That's how I ended up at the Silver Rail, a dim-lit bar where I found Rachel Adams, his mistress. She walked in wearing a red dress, every head turning, but her eyes carried the weight of someone barely keeping it together. I slid an envelope toward her, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. Inside were copies of the forged deed with her name on it, paired with public records of her debts. I told her what Jason had promised and what he had really done. At first she laughed, brushing me off, but I saw her hands tremble as she turned through the pages. Her face drained of color, and I knew the truth had landed. She admitted, in a whisper, that Jason had used her just like he used everyone else. He had dangled promises of land and a clean slate, but all he left her with was risk and lies. When I told her she had one chance to walk away with her dignity to testify, she hesitated, then nodded. It wasn't trust I saw in her eyes, but fear mixed with the faintest spark of resolve. As I left that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. For the first time, Jason wasn't just standing against me. He was losing pieces of his own army, with Rachel willing to step into the light. I knew the next battleground wouldn't be pawn shop whispers or anonymous threats. It would be a courtroom, and this time, the truth would stand on solid ground. The courthouse felt smaller than I remembered, like the walls had leaned in to hear every whisper. By 8:30 in the morning, the benches were packed, the air thick with perfume and coffee and curiosity. I could feel eyes on the back of my neck as I guided Emily to our row. Her hand was cold in mine. I told myself to breathe like an officer and feel like a mother, both at once. When the judge entered, the room stilled. Even the old clock seemed to hold its tick for a heartbeat. We started with the bones of the case, the parts that don't flinch under light. The doctor took the stand first, speaking in careful, measured language that left no room for rumor. I watched the jury lean forward when the photographs appeared on the screen, the swelling, the pattern of bruising, the timeline that matched the night Emily arrived at my door. No theatrics, just anatomy and cause. Somewhere behind me, a whisper tried to rise, then died in the quiet that followed. Next came the porch footage. The lights dimmed, the video flickered, and there was my house at 1 o'clock in the morning, grainy but undeniable. Emily, unsteady on her feet. The weak knock, my door opening, my arms catching her. I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my eyes trained on the screen because truth deserves witnesses. When the lights came back up, the room carried that heavy silence I know from accident scenes, the moment when people accept what happened because they've seen it. Then the phone logs, threat after threat scrolling like a sickness across the monitor, the possessive demands, the warnings to keep quiet, the promises of consequences. I didn't look at Jason as the logs were authenticated. I looked at Emily. Her jaw trembled, but she held steady. I thought, this is what courage looks like at 26, not grand speeches, just showing up while strangers read your pain into the record. The records clerk, Ben Foster, followed. He laid the forged deed on the table as if it were a weapon taken from a suspect, and in a way, it was. He walked the court through the notary discrepancy, the stamp that didn't match the log, the signatures that stuttered where a practiced hand would flow. I saw eyes dart from the papers to Jason and back again. The land wasn't just acreage. It was my father's sweat, my mother's prayers, Emily's childhood. Hearing its theft described in bureaucratic terms made the betrayal ring sharper, not duller. Finally, Rachel. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, but she stood and told the truth anyway. She admitted the promises Jason had made, the pressure he'd applied, the way he'd dangled our land like a prize for obedience. Her words were not dramatic. They were tired, careful, and devastating. I felt the balance in the room shift, as if the floor had found level after listening to gossip for too long. That was when Jason cracked. He lurched up, anger spiking off him like heat, and the quiet shattered. I didn't turn toward him. I kept my eyes on the judge because power belongs where the gavel is. The bailiff moved. The judge's voice cut through the noise. Order returned in the blunt way only a courtroom can manufacture. In my chest, a steadier kind of heartbeat began. The ruling came like steps down a hallway measured, inescapable. A protective order for Emily that left no door for him to knock on again. The deed transfer nullified, the land restored to its rightful owner. Assets frozen pending further investigation, no quick sell-offs, no disappearing funds. And then the final note referral to the district attorney for charges of domestic violence, fraud, and intimidation. Each finding hit like a clean note on a bell. I felt my shoulders lower for the first time in weeks. The bailiff reached for Jason's wrists. The click of the handcuffs was small, almost polite, but it echoed through me like thunder. I didn't celebrate. I held Emily's hand and felt the tremor turn into a long, breaking exhale. Justice doesn't erase bruises. It just draws a line that says enough, around us. The murmurs returned softer now. Changed. I let the sound wash past. My job in that room was done. The officer in me had gathered and delivered evidence. The mother in me had stood beside her child without blinking. But I knew the hardest work wasn't over. Healing doesn't follow a court schedule. It comes in the middle of the night, in small breaths and slow mornings, in counseling rooms and quiet kitchens. As we stepped into the corridor's cooler air, I felt the case file under my arm and Emily's weight on my shoulder. The fight for truth had been won here today, but the work of stitching a life back together was waiting for us just outside those doors. And that is where we were headed next. The courtroom had been filled with noise and judgment, but the silence that followed Jason's sentencing was almost heavier. For the first time in months, I felt the tight band across my chest loosen. Yet the road ahead was clear. It wasn't over. Not really. Justice had been served, but healing was its own kind of trial. Emily struggled in the weeks that followed. Sleep rarely came easy for her, and when it did, nightmares often yanked her back into the dark. I'd hear her pacing at 2 a.m, whispering to herself, fighting ghosts only she could see. Therapy became our anchor. At first, she resisted, sitting stiff in those sessions, arms crossed, eyes down. But little by little, she began to speak. And when she did, it was like watching someone find their own voice again. Shaky at first, but growing steadier each week. There were small victories that meant everything. The first time she drove herself to the grocery store. The afternoon she laughed, really laughed while we cooked dinner together. The sound surprising us both. I clung to those moments, even when the shadows returned, because they were proof recovery was not a straight line, but it was a line moving forward. As for me, I had to learn to stand in both roles at once, mother and officer. At home, I was soft hands and steady presence. On patrol, I found myself drawn to women who carried the same kind of fear I'd seen in Emily's eyes. I'd sit with them longer than protocol required, share a piece of my story when it felt right, and remind them they weren't alone. I'd spent decades enforcing the law, but only now did I truly understand how silence becomes its own prison. Some days, the anger still flared at Jason, at the system, at myself for not seeing the danger sooner. But anger, I realized, could be reshaped. It could become fuel for something better. Emily's path isn't finished, and neither is mine. Healing takes time, and that's a truth we live with daily. But the weight of silence no longer hangs in this house. We've replaced it with conversations, with therapy notes on the fridge, with the unsteady but hopeful rhythm of moving forward. If there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's this: silence feeds abuse. Truth, even when it shakes your world, is the only thing that can set you free. So, if my story speaks to you, if you've ever stood where Emily stood or loved someone who has, I ask you, share this. Leave a comment. Let someone else know they aren't alone. Because the courage to speak up doesn't just protect one person, it can save generations.